In this video we are going to look at all the functions within the Extrude and Weave tool, and we'll be looking at all sorts of different results you can create using this powerful function. So let's just go and close this down. So we'll go and open an existing file, and from the Extrude Weave guide project folder we're going to bring in the extrude example.crv 3D file. Press open there. We can see that we have a simple set of vectors that we've created in the software, and this will help us to demonstrate the features within the Extrude and Weave function. So let's go and tile our windows vertically, that way we can see the 2D view on the left, and then we can see the 3D view on the right hand side. To access the Extrude Weave tool, we need to go into the Modelling tab, and it's the third icon along underneath the Modelling tools. We can see it says Extrude a shape using one or more centerline vectors. So we'll go in there. So we'll start by looking at a simple example. So the first thing that I need to do is select one or more vectors that will represent our drive rails. So I'm going to select this S curve here. We're going to go over and say Use Selection. And so the software has now transformed that vector into a drive rail. I can see that we have a green node here, and this is showing me the start point. I also have these arrowheads that are informing me of the direction that the shape is going to flow. So the next thing that I need to do now is go ahead and select an open vector that's going to represent the cross section that will be extruded along our drive rail. So we'll just go some of the default settings that are in here. We will talk about these in more detail throughout the tutorial. We can see here we have the option to scale to an exact height. For the moment I'm just going to leave that blank and let the software scale the part based on my cross section. Then we need to select how we would like our component to combine with other components if we had any within our component tree. So we could choose the option to add that, we could subtract it, merge high, or we could look at merging low. And then it's always a good idea to go and name your component. And so for this part I'm going to call this Extrude. And then we can go and press Apply. And the software is going to create a shape based on the vectors that we had selected. We can see the shape is represented in yellow in the 2D view here, and we can see that 3D shape that we've just created, where we can see that cross section being extruded along the shape of our rail. So if we wanted to, we could go over and press close, or we could go and start a new component if we wanted to go and create another extruded shape. For the time being, I'm going to press close. We can see that's been added to our modelling plane there. We've got the grayscale in the 2D view, and we also have a component within our component tree there. I'm just going to right mouse click. We're just going to go and delete that component. Then we're going to go back into the extruder shape using one or more centerline vectors. I'm just going to put that in Z. So I'm going to go and select that S curve again. I'm going to use selection, and then we're going to go and select the same cross section. Now instead of me pressing apply like we did before, I'm actually going to apply that to the end of our rail here, and so that's assigned that cross section to both ends of my curve. And so if I press apply now, we still get the same shape that we did before, and that's what the software does if we just use one single cross section. What I can do now is I can look at changing our current cross sections, or I could look at adding in additional cross sections if I wanted to. For instance, I could take this rectangular shape here and then put that on the end there, and we can see that that round cross section has been replaced by this larger cross section here. We can see that's indicated by the coloured nodes. We can see there's a yellow node here. If we look on our rectangular shape, we can see the yellow node there. If we look on this side here, we've got a red node here, and then on our curved shape we also have a red node there. And so if I went ahead and applied that, Then we can see how the software has took into account this new shape on the end here. We can see how that looks. So we can see we're starting off with that rounded shape on one end here, and then it's going to come round, and then it's going to transform into this rectangular cross section that we have on the end there. And we know that our rectangular shape is a lot wider than our curve shape, and so the software has then taken into account this shape, and so my overall shape gets wider as it travels from one cross section to the other. Now if I wanted, I could go in and add in a further cross section, so I could go and select this vector here. If I wanted to, I could just apply that somewhere in the middle. You can see it's represented by that green node there, and we can see that green node there at the bottom of our cross section shape here. And so if I went ahead and pressed apply, we can see the difference there. We've got this round shape slowly progressing into this angular shape of this triangle here, and then it's going to get to the end and transform into that rectangular shape that we can see on the other side. We can also move our cross sections once they've been applied. So I could take this one here and move it over if I wanted to and apply that. We can see the instant results there in the 3D view. I could even take our end cross section here and move that all the way over, press apply. We can see a shape taking form between the cross sections. And I could pull that out if I wanted to bring it back round, apply that. And so not only do we have these options within this form, I can also look at using the right mouse options. So if I hover over this node here, right mouse click, you can see we have the option to smooth that. We could delete the cross section or add to all rail nodes. I'm going to use this option to delete the cross section. Once we do that, we can see that's been removed in the 2D view. And so if I apply that, we can see it's updated that, and then it's put it back to how we had at the start. Let's pop that back in Z there. Another thing that we can do is right mouse click on the rail itself, and you can see that we get a different menu. We have the reverse rail, insert a start point, or remove all cross sections. So if we use the reverse rail option, what that does is change the order. So we can see that represented by the red node here. Our curve shape is now on this side, and then our rectangular shape is going to be on this side here. So if we applied that, we could see those changes being made there. And so the round shape is still at the start of our shape, it's just reversed the way that the cross sections are flowing through that shape. And so we can see it's travelling from right to left, and we can also see that indicated by these arrowheads here in the 2D view. So if I hover over that rail again and right mouse click, we could reverse that and bring it back and press apply there, and then it's going from left to right there. Now if we had the same asymmetrical cross section going through the shape, then that option would reverse the direction of the shape left to right. So I'm just going to use this option over here to clear rails. That's going to remove the component and deselect everything that we've got here. I'm going to go and select that curve again and say use selection. This time I'm going to use this angled shape here. I'm going to apply that so that we can see the indicators on our nodes there. And then if I press apply there, we can see how that shape is formed. So you can see the bottom of our shape on the left hand side here is going to hang from the top area here. And so now if I go ahead and reverse the rail by saying reverse rail and then press apply, we can see the shape has swapped over, and we can see that's indicated by this node here. So the bottom of our shape will be now hung from the bottom of this curve here, and we can see that there in the 3D view. So as we've reversed the direction of the curve, we've therefore reversed the orientation that we had those cross sections flowing. And so if I right mouse click again and then reverse the rail and then press apply, we can see that it's changed that over. I'm going to go and select another vector here. So I'm going to take this one, and this is a mirrored copy of this vector that we already had selected. And so I'm just going to apply that to the end. So we're just replacing that now. We can see that it's been replaced because the node has turned yellow here, and that matches the yellow node that we've got down here. And so if I go ahead and apply that shape, and we can see what this mirrored cross section looks like. So we're starting off on this edge here. We know it's represented by this cross section here. So we have that flat shape coming at the top there, and then as it gets to the end, it's joining up with this smaller shape that we've got here on this mirrored cross section. So we can see that edge there. And so on the other side, we know that this shape is going to be hung on the bottom here, and we can see that there in the 3D view, and then as it travels through, we can see it's going to get to that flat edge on this side of our cross section here. And so that's why we're getting this peak transversing along the shape in the S-curve. And the reason for that is that the software is doing this because we have this option here checked, the sweep between spans. And so it's sweeping between each cross-section span, and the software can only do this if the cross-section has the same number of spans. We can see in our two examples here that we have 2 spans in each of those, so it's allowing us to do that. Now if we go ahead and switch that off and then press apply, we can see that the shape has changed, and what it's doing now is it's transitioning through the parts linearly. And if we switch that back on again, press apply, we can see how the sweep between spans makes that difference. And so if I went and added in another cross section, like this rectangular shape here, which we can clearly see has 3 spans on there, if I added that, we can see the software has added these numbers to each of our cross sections, and it's telling us how many spans are in each of those cross sections. And so it wouldn't allow us to use the option to sweep between spans, and so it would default to just transition the shape linearly. If you're not sure, a good way to see the difference between the shapes is simply just to switch it on and off. Another thing that we can do whilst in the Extrude and Weave form is edit our vectors. We can go into Node Edit mode and change the shape of our rails, or we could look at changing the shape of our cross sections. We don't need to come out the form and edit those. So the way to do that is we just press N on the keyboard. That's the shortcut key for Node Edit. I'm going to select the vector that I'd like to alter, in which I could then just go and use the normal Node Edit tools and just alter the shape of my vectors. Okay, another thing that I could do is go and edit the shape of cross sections if I wanted. I could pull this node down like so, and then I could come over here and use the option to reselect rails, and it will remember the cross sections that I had used previously. So then if I went ahead then and pressed apply, so you can see where we've introduced that sharp corner there, it's now created this discontinuity in the shape because it's too wide for it to go around that corner without it overlapping itself. And so you need to be aware of the shapes of your drive rails to ensure that the cross sections have enough room to fit. So if we come over and use this option here to reset that, you can see it's going to reset the shape. However, our rails and our cross sections are still selected, and if I wanted to go and use new rails and cross sections, then I'll go and use this option up here to clear rails, and then we go back into normal selection mode, where I could go in there, press N on the keyboard to go into Node Edit mode again and alter the shape, and then if I wanted to I could go and select that back into Use Selection, and then we can go and select our cross section, apply that, and we've got our new shape there. And then if I use the option to clear rails when there is a component being created, that will delete the component too. So I'm just going to go and undo all of those changes that I made to this vector. So we're going to go into Edit, I'm going to use the option to undo node editing. You can see also the shortcut key to do that is Control and Z. So I'm going to press that, and I'm going to use the shortcut key Control and Z until I'm back to how my vector was at the start of this example. So far we've looked at open rails. We can also look at creating shapes with closed vectors too. So I'm going to go and select this vector here and then say use selection. I'm going to apply this cross section and then we can go and apply that. And we can see that we have a rather pleasing shape with these nice mitered corners here. And the reason for those corners that we've got there is because we've got this option to create square corners. And so what it's doing, it's creating these mitered corners at each 90-degree bend. And if I uncheck that and then applied it, we can see that we have radiused edges now. So if I select that again and apply it, we have these nice mitered corners. With the open rails, we looked at how we can add in cross sections wherever we wanted. We can do that in this case also. So if we applied that to this node here, then if we right mouse clicked and then use the option to add to all rail nodes, you can see it's going to apply that at all of those nodes there. And so if we applied that, we can see that we still have the same shape as we had before, but now we could look at maybe changing some of those cross sections. So I'm going to go and select this cross section here, apply that there. We could say apply. We could see how that shape is now been changed. We could also move that down if I wanted to, then go ahead and press apply there. And again we can see how those changes are being made. Now the one thing that I can't easily replace, and that's the cross section that's at the start point, which is this one here. And that's because when we create a closed vector rail, the start and end points are practically the same. So if I wanted to change this to be a different cross section, the only way that I could do that is to come in up here and clearing the rails and then going and reselecting the vectors that I wanted instead. So that is a good thing to remember if you're wanting to change the cross section of your start point within a closed rail. So I'm just going to use the option to clear rails. I'm going to go and select this oval shape here. I'm going to use selection, and then I'm going to apply this cross section and put that in to our rails there. We'll press apply to see how that looks. And we can see, judging by the coloured indicators of our nodes here, where we have the red at the bottom of our cross section here, we can see that that's corresponding with the red node here, and so we can see that shape in the 3D view there, where we have the slanted shape and then the rather flat shape coming out at the back there. And so if I hovered over the rail and right mouse clicked and then pressed reverse rail and then applied that, and so that swapped the rail order, and therefore the cross section is hung in the opposite direction. Another thing that I can do is hover over the rail here. I could right mouse click and use the option to insert a start point, or I could just run my cursor around until I find a node, and we can see that node icon there, and so I could go ahead and insert a point there. And I could go and insert a point over here and one over here. Then I could go and really control the shape of this part now, so I could go and add in and swap around the cross sections. So let's go and take this cross section here, and I'm going to go and apply that to this point here and this point here, and then if we applied that, we can see how the shapes are being changed. And so we have a lot of control over the shape that we'd like to create. Well, so far we've looked at how we can extrude vectors along our rails. We also have the ability to extrude components too. And so if we just clear the rails, and then I'm just going to go and close this form down, put that in Z. I'm going to go into this option here to import a component or a 3D model. I'm going to go and import the grape leaf from the project folder and press open. You can see that's been imported in there. I'm just going to align that, so we'll align selected objects. I'm going to align that to the center of my material, and we can close that. And with that selected, I'm just going to alter the size of that. So we're going to go to set size. I'm going to make the height of that to be 1.5 and then press apply, and we can close that. And then I'm just going to go and rotate that. So let's rotate that about its own center. So we'll make sure that's checked there. And I'm going to go with a 90-degree angle and then press apply, and then it will become apparent as to why I've done that in a moment. So let's close that form down. We'll go back into the Extrude and Weave tool. I'm going to select this vector for my drive rail, so we'll say use selection. This time we're going to use a component, so we'll make sure we have that option checked. And then to select our component we need to use this drop down menu, and we can see that this is the only component that we have in our job, and so we'll make sure that's selected. There isn't any other way for you to select your components. You can't select them in the 2D or the 3D view. You can only select them using this drop down menu here. Then we're going to use the option to fill with multiple copies. For the time being we're just going to go with a 0% overlap, and then if we go ahead and press apply and see how that looks. So we can see that that's extruded a copy of those leaves along our curve. And with that 0% overlap, it means that the end of one of our leaves meets the back end of the next leaf. And so the reason that we rotated that leaf is so that that's how the software will look at it in order for it to orientate it along the curve. And so that it looks at it from left to right, and that's the direction that it will flow along the rail. So let's have a look and see what happens if we alter the overlap. So if we bring that all the way up to say around 30% and then press applied. And so if we take a look at that, we can see that they're blending into each other. And so to help ourselves out, I'm just going to look at applying a tilt to our original component. So if we close that down, then I'm just going to take that, I'm just going to right mouse click and delete it. And then with that component, the grape leaf, we're going to go into the component properties. And what I'd like to do is just go ahead and apply a tilt from the left to the right hand side, so that this end here, where it overlaps the back end of the leaf that it's in front of, it's going to have that height difference, so we should get a nice look. So with that selected, let's go and use the tilt option here. We're going to set our anchor. I'm going to go from the left, so I'm going to click here, pull that cursor out, click on the right hand side to apply that direction, and then all I'm going to do is go for around 5-degree wedge. We can see that's just lifted that up on the right hand side there. So it's similar to applying a base height, except we're applying it to just one end at an angle, so we're creating that wedge shape there. So this should hopefully help us when we create that overlap when we extrude the shape. So if we close that down, then we'll go back into the extruder shape form and select that curve again. We'll say use selection. I'm just going to zoom out in the 3D view. I'll pop that in ISO view for now. Then we're going to use the component. We're going to use that grape leaf. We're going to fill with multiple copies at 30% and press apply. And so if we take a look at that, we can see we have a rather pleasing effect with the combination of the tilted component and how we use the fill multiple copies with the overlap. To help me see that a little bit better, I could reduce that overlap, say 20%, and apply that. Okay, we can see how that's working a little bit better here. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Another thing that we could do is look at flipping the alternate copies. So we'll check that and then apply that, and we can see there that every other leaf is in the same direction. So we've got a leaf that's going left, the next one is going in the right, then the next one is left again and right, and so on. So to see this a little bit better, let's just close that down. I'm just going to delete that component that we just created by using the right mouse option. I'm going to select our leaf here. I'm just going to look at rotating that to be around the 4 or 5 o'clock position. I'm going to go back into the extruder shape. We're going to say select our rail and use selection there. I'm going to use a component. I'm going to choose that grape component. Again, we're going to go the same settings. If we press apply here, we can see how that flip alternate copies makes a big difference there. So let's just clear that, and then we'll go and see what happens when we use closed shapes. So I'm going to select this vector here, then we're going to go and use selection. Okay, this time I'm going to uncheck flip, and then we're just going to go the same settings, and then we'll press apply. Okay, and if we take a look at that in the 3D view, we can see that the shape that we're going to get is quite distorted here. And not all shapes and components will give you good results. And so if we go and clear that, and then we'll select this one instead, and then say use selection, and then apply that like we had before. Let's take a look at that. We can see that as it's a smoother shape, we're getting less distortion as the shape is being extruded around this smooth shape. And then we could use this option to flip alternate copies and press apply, and we can see that we'll have a nice set of overlapping components there. And so this is a very powerful function. And we can extrude along multiple rails, and we'll talk about that next. So I'm going to go and close this form down. We can see that component's been added to our component tree, and you'll notice that it is just one individual component. It doesn't contain all of these individual leaf components, it just creates one entity. So we'll go over to File, we're just going to close that down, I'm not going to save that. I'm going to go and open another file from the project folder. We're going to open the weaveexample.crv 3D file and then press open. And so you can see that we've got a different set of vectors that we're going to use to demonstrate the Extrude and Weave tools. So again, let's go and tile our windows vertically. I'm going to go back into that extrude form. So we'll go into the modeling tab, and we'll use the Extrude and Weave tool. Okay, so I'm going to go and select all of these vectors here. I'd like to use these in our selection and transform all of those into drive rails. I'm then going to apply this cross section to those rails and then press apply. And you can see that we're getting the result that we'd expect from what we've learnt in the earlier examples. Now where the vectors overlap, like we can see here, we can get the software to create a weave effect where it will raise the shape up and down where each part crosses over. And to do that we use this option over here, the weave under and over at crossings. And so for this example we're just going to use the option to scale shape, and we're going to put in a Z under value of 100% and a Z over value also at 100% there. And then if I go ahead and press apply, we can see that there is no difference because it's scaling both of those at 100% of its current height, no matter whether it's overlapping. And so what we want to do is we want to make it look as though it's going under or over where they're crossing over. So what I need to do is change the Z under and the Z over. So for example, if I made the Z under at 50% and left the Z over at 100%, and then if we press apply, what it will do, it will reduce the height of our cross section as it's extruded along the areas where it overlaps by half of its original height. So that's that 50%. So if we apply that, we can see that those changes have been made there, and so it's coming under at 50% of its original height that it was up here. And so if we change the Z under back to 100% and then press apply, you can see that it's back to how it was before. But now if I go and change the Z over to be 150 and then press apply there, instead of it going under at these locations, we can see it's now going over and raising up 50% its original height that it was before. So if I go and change that to be 50% under and keep the Z over at 150% and then press apply, we can see that we've got more prominence in that weave. So it's coming over and then going right under and then coming back over again. So now if I change the cross section to be this round one here and went with the same settings that we've got and press apply there, you can see that we're starting to get these areas that aren't completely clearing each other. And so in order for us to create the look that it's going over and under each other, we either need to look at drastically reducing or increasing these values. So we'll make that 30% under and say 170 over and then press apply. We can see that we're getting these straight lines now, so it looks more prominent where areas are going over and under each other. If we change the cross section again, and we'll make it to be this ridged cross section and press apply there, and then if we take a look at how the part looks here, we can see that it's really squashing the shape at areas where it needs to come under, and we can see it's raising the part up a little bit too much where it's coming over, and so we're still getting that weave, however we're just losing the consistency that we have with that shape. And so there is another option that we can use. Rather than using the scale shape option, we could look at using this add a base option here. And so we'll look at raising the whole thing up by adding material underneath. So if we make the Z under at 0%, so we have no material added where it goes underneath, but where the part will go over, we'll make that 100% of the original height, but just as a vertical edge. And so if we press apply there, we can see that we have a much more consistent shape going through, but all it's doing is adding in the base height. And so adding in that base height will give us a higher Z height in the overall component than if we were to use the scale shape option. And so it's just about choosing the right one that suits the part that you're creating. So it's easy to just switch through both of those, and then it will remember the settings that you used previously, and we could go back there and then use the add base option if we preferred that one. So even though we're creating a weave, we can still access other parts of the tool. For example, if I wanted to assign this cross section to the start and ends of all of those rails, I could go and click on one of the nodes, and we've done that there. I could then go and select other cross sections if I wanted to, so I could select this curved shape here and assign that to the end of this rail here and the end of this rail here. I could select this rectangular shape, assign that to the end of this rail here and the end of this rail here, and I could go ahead and apply that and see those changes there. I could also go and apply different cross sections in between rails, so I could select this ridge shape here and put that in position there and go ahead and apply that. We can see we've got that round shape going into that ridge shape, going back out into that round shape, and you can see that we have a really powerful function here where we can extrude shapes and weave them at the same time. And so we can close that. I'm just going to go and delete that component there. So we'll right mouse click and then use the option to delete that. Then we'll put that back in ISO view there. Another thing that can be quite important is the order that the shapes are woven in, as into which parts go up and which parts go down, and we can control this by reversing the first drive rail that you select. So you need to make sure that you have selected a single drive rail first. So I'm going to select this one first, then I'm going to go and select my others. It doesn't matter about the order of the other vectors that I select to be my drive rails. So with those selected, remember we selected this as our first drive rail, and if we go over to the extruder shape tool, and then we can go and say use selection, we can go and select our cross section, and then let's just apply that, and we can see that it's going over at the bottom at the start point here and then going underneath here. And then if I right mouse clicked and use the option to reverse rail and press apply, we can see now it's going over at the top and coming underneath here. And so it looks at the first drive rail as a basis to work out the others. So let's just close that. I'm going to go and select that component and then just go ahead and delete it. So I'm going to go into my layers tab. I'm just going to look at another example here. I'm going to switch off the simple weave layer, switch on the circle weave layer. I'm going to select it so it's bold, so it's the active layer. Then we're going to go back over to the modeling tab. And we can take a look at these vectors. We created one circle, and using the mirror option we created copies about the center. So I'm going to go and select all of these circles here. I'm going to go and use the extruder shape. and say use selection, and again I could go and select my cross section and apply that, and we can see how that looks. It's still got the weave option checked, and it's remembered the last add base Z under Z over percentage that we used, and it's created that rather nice complex looking part. Now another thing that we can do is, rather than using vectors, we can look at using components to extrude the shape. So let's just go and close that down. I'm just going to select that component, right mouse click, and I'm just going to delete that. Then we're going to go over to import a component. Then I'm going to go and use this option, this weave group .3D clip, and we're going to look at importing that in. So I'll say open, and we can see that rather small shape there. You can see it's a flower on top of an extruded shape. So if I pop that in ISO, I'm just going to deselect that. I'm going to go into the extrude form, and I'm going to go ahead and select the vectors for my drive rails and say use selection. This time we're going to go and use a component. Remember, we need to select our component from the drop down list, so we've got our weave group there. So I'm going to go fill multiple copies, 10%, and make sure flip alternate copies is unchecked, and then we could go ahead and press apply there. And so we can see we have a rather complex looking part there, and because of that 10% overlap we have a seamless part. Okay, we could look at increasing the overlap if we wanted to be around 40%, and let's apply that. We could say that we have an even more complex looking shape, and all we've done is just altered a few settings within the form. So I'm just going to put that in ISO. And to finish, we're going to look at this option here to stretch to drive rail length. So if we just close the form down, and I'm just going to go and delete these components. I'm going to right mouse click them and delete them. I'm going to go into my layers tab. I'm going to switch off the circle weave, switch on the stretch weave, select it to make it that active layer. Then we're going to go into the modeling tab, and I'm going to go and import a component. So I'm going to go and import a component from this option here. I'm going to go and import the paintbrush and press open there. We can see that's brought that in. I'm just going to go and rotate that. So we're going to rotate selected objects about its center point. I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees and then press apply. We can close that. I'm just going to move that up here. I'm just going to alter the size of that, so we'll go over and set the size of that part. We're going to give that a width of 8 inches. We'll make sure link XY is checked so it scales in proportion. Then we can go ahead and press apply there. Then we can close that down. So let's go into the extrude tool again. I'm going to go and select this vector as my rail. We'll say use selection. Then we're going to go and use a component. So we're going to use the paintbrush component. This time I'm going to stretch to drive rail length. I'm going to uncheck weave under and over at crossings, and then we're going to go and press apply. And so we can see that what it's done to that component, it's stretched it and distorted it along the curve that we've got selected, and this will work with any open or closed rails. I'm just going to reset that for the moment, and I'm going to go and clear the rails, and this time I'm going to select both of these vectors here. We're going to say use selection. Again, we're going to use the paintbrush. We're going to stretch to drive rail length. This time I'm going to apply the weave here. Okay, so for this we're going to use the scale shape. I'm going to make the Z under at 50% and the Z over at 150%. Then I'm going to go and press apply, and we can see the results there. And if I wanted to, I could alter the Z under there, make that 75, and make the Z over still at 150, and then we could go ahead and press apply. You can see we're getting better results there. And so this is a really powerful tool if you wanted to get components to follow a line and weave at the same time. So I'm happy with that, so I'm going to go and close that. And again we can see that the result of that component is just one individual component. And so that really completes this guide on how to use the Extrude Weave function, where we've looked at all of the various options within the form to control the shapes of the components. We've seen how this powerful tool can take a simple set of vectors and easily create complex looking shapes. And you'll see examples of how we use the Extrude and Weave tool in other project tutorials.